The epic rise of Theranos and its equally epic unraveling has turned out to be one of the most spectacular stories in recent years. Theranos went down as the largest fraud since Enron and the greatest scandal in Silicon Valley's history. But thus far, the media narratives have invariably focused on the company's young founder and CEO, Elizabeth Holmes. Countless reports and documentaries are all based on the unlikely assumption that Theranos was her own brainchild and that she alone drove the fraudulent venture. I will present a different perspective here, one which places Theranos in the context of the still ongoing pandemic and the coercive measures planned by global health authorities. As you'll see, the real story of Theranos will prove extremely relevant to our present predicament. Perhaps most importantly, however, there is a silver lining to this story. If you happen to feel pessimistic about the way things are going now, there's a very encouraging and inspiring aspect to the story of Theranos. When you consider what I'm about to explain here, I believe that you'll feel a lot more optimistic about the way things are today. Before we get into the real story of Theranos, however, please indulge me for a very short promotional message. I'm Alex Craner, founder of Craner Analytics and publisher of the iSystem Trend Compass reports. If you manage your own investment portfolio, congratulations. However, you do have the odds stacked against you. As many as 4 out of 5 individual investors lose money, which is a staggering statistic given that since 2009 we've had the longest bull market in history and all investors should have at least tripled their money. The problem is that most investors trade with flawed strategies or no strategy at all. So what is the most effective long-term strategy of investing? Without a doubt, it's trend following. Simply, markets move in trends, and trends are far and away the most powerful drivers of investment performance. You'll find the case compellingly corroborated on my site. Daily Trend Compass reports provide reliable and effective decision support that will enable you to navigate market trends in more than 200 financial and commodities markets profitably, with confidence and peace of mind, both in bull and bear markets. Subscription rates start at €100 a month, and the first month test drive is always free. So consider signing up already today. You'll find the relevant links in the description below this video. So back to our story. Theranos was started in 2003 by the 19-year-old Stanford University dropout Elizabeth Holmes. She claimed that she had invented a miniature blood analyzer that could perform as many as 240 different blood tests from just a single drop of blood. Traditionally, blood testing is done by drawing one or several vials of blood from patients to be analyzed on special lab devices developed by companies like Siemens, Abbott Labs, Quest Diagnostics, and LabCorp. Elizabeth Holmes claimed that her portable analyzers would revolutionize the process, democratize diagnostics, and make the test so affordable that people could make periodic snapshots of their personal health over time. That was the story that enabled the audacious 19-year-old to launch Theranos, raise a total of over $750 million in funding, and assemble a board of directors counting some of the most powerful individuals in the United States political establishment. Theranos obtained funding from a number of high-profile capitalists, including the billionaire venture capitalist Tim Draper, Don Lucas Sr., Rupert Murdoch, the Walton family Betsy DeVos, Larry Ellison, Mexican billionaire Carlos Slim, and companies like Walgreens and Safeway. Theranos' board of directors included former Secretaries of State Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, former Defense Secretary William Perry, future Defense Secretary General James Mad Dog Mattis, former U.S. Senator and Chair of the Armed Services Committee Sam Nunn, power lawyer David Boies, retired U.S. Navy Admiral Gary Roughead, and former CEO of Wells Fargo Bank Richard Kovacevic. It was indeed the board to take over the world. But there was a big problem at the core of this venture, namely, Holmes' inventions were mostly imaginary, her technology could only perform a handful of the tests and none of them reliably, and her mission was based on wishful thinking. So how was she able to build her house of cards with such an impressive facade and make herself into America's favorite entrepreneur and youngest female self-made billionaire? The narrative offered by virtually all reports is that it was down to her supposed brilliance, her story, conviction, charisma, and her disarming personal charm.
We've been led to believe that those were the weapons she used to persuade some of the most powerful people in the world to become directors of her startup and to convince a group of seasoned investors and experienced business people to back her venture with hundreds of millions of dollars. Even though this story is hugely implausible, it is nevertheless being told and retold in the media without much critical analysis or skepticism, allowing only for the possibility that Holmes' one co-conspirator was her partner and boyfriend, Ramesh Sunny Balwani. Over the last 20 years, part of my own work has been raising money from wealthy investors. Based on my own experience, I find the Elizabeth Holmes story completely impossible to believe. Now, my experience was different in that I wasn't raising money for a tech startup and I never worked in Silicon Valley. Rather, I sought funding for hedge fund ventures. However, the process in essence is the same. You go to wealthy investors and pitch your project hoping to raise funds. Your counterparts are shopping for investments that can give them a high return on their capital. That experience gave me a good sense of the way wealthy individuals make their investment decisions. For starters, they are not stupid. They're usually quite rigorous and don't easily fall for cosmetics or charm. It's true that some investors spray money on startup ventures less discriminately with the rationale that some projects will succeed. Typically, they look at your team, your business plan, demand some proof of concept, and if they're half convinced that you have a shot at succeeding, they might give you some money. But in such cases, we're normally talking about relatively small sums, say a few $100,000 or something in that ballpark. But when it comes to large sums of money, investors tend to be very demanding. Venture capital funds tend to specialize in a limited number of industries, and they use domain experts to vet prospective investments. These experts' job is to do thorough due diligence on potential investments so that they can distill the most likely future success stories out of many, many applicants. The due diligence process is itself a costly, time-consuming operation, and I would expect that in Silicon Valley, which attracts top-notch creative talent from all over the world, the process is quick to eliminate candidates that fail to provide convincing evidence that they have a sound concept, competent management team, and a compelling, coherent business strategy. For larger investments counting in tens of millions of dollars, the due diligence process might even include extensive background checks on the company executives. The cosmetics alone, the stories, visions, displays of confidence or personal charm won't get you even past the first of the many gatekeepers if the stuff behind the facade isn't convincing. In Elizabeth Holmes' case, even minimal due diligence should have eliminated her. She set out to revolutionize healthcare but had no qualification or experience in medicine and only rudimentary training in biochemistry. In almost all cases, her patents specified design of future solutions but did not detail the process or functionality. She published no technical specifications or white papers and could not demonstrate that her supposed inventions even worked. Any specialist in the field of medicine or biochemistry would have easily disqualified Elizabeth Holmes' claims and determined that there was no substance to her story. For example, Holmes was twice introduced to Stanford clinical pharmacologist and professor of medicine Dr. Phyllis Gardner with the recommendation that she was just brilliant and had a revolutionary investment idea. But Professor Gardner saw right through her. Here's what she said about Holmes. She had no knowledge of medicine and rudimentary knowledge of engineering, and she really didn't want any expertise. She thought she knew it all. Another qualified longtime observer of Theranos saga was also skeptical. Dr. Darren Saunders worked as an associate professor of medicine at the University of New South Wales, where he ran Ubiquitin Signaling Lab. He knew that Holmes could never do what she claimed. In an interview for 60 Minutes Australia program, he said that it takes years and years to develop any one of those tests and make sure that it's accurate. Indeed, what was glaringly obvious to Dr. Gardner and Dr. Saunders should have been just as obvious to any specialist in the field. In fact, Holmes also failed to convince US military to adopt Theranos technology. In spite of wholehearted help for General Mattis, she was unable to pass the vetting process at the Pentagon. A few years later, in May 2015, University of Toronto professor Eleftherios Diamandis analyzed Theranos technology and also politely concluded that most of the company's claims are exaggerated. Diamandis expressed that opinion at the time when hype about Theranos and Holmes were at their peak. But for some mysterious reason, no scrutiny of her fantastic claims would obstruct Elizabeth Holmes' ascent. Early on, not only was she able to get a face-to-face meeting with Don Lucas Sr., one of the most prominent venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, she also managed to persuade him to make a large investment in Theranos. Lucas explained his rationale for that decision in a 2009 interview. Her great-grandfather was an entrepreneur, very successful, and it turned out later that the hospital near where her family lives is named after her great-uncle. Apparently, her great-uncle's and great-grandfather's success was enough to convince Lucas to invest in her project. I wonder if that same qualification was equally convincing to all other investors, or was it her passion and charm? Whatever the case, big fish investors gave her more than $750 million with no concern about her qualifications or the functioning of her technology. This is all very strange, to put it politely. The media have meanwhile offered a plausible-sounding explanation for this. You see, the big investors gave Holmes a ton of cash because they were just that afraid of missing the next Facebook or Google. But this explanation is just as unlikely as the rest of the story. Again, one could accept such rationalizations if Holmes had obtained an odd few $100,000 here and there, but it does not explain massive allocations she obtained from a group of top-notch power players. It also fails to explain the strange terms of investment, the disallowed verification of Theranos technology, or company valuation that would soar to $9 billion. So what's the real story? How did Holmes manage to get that meeting with Don Lucas Sr.? How did she meet Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Rupert Murdoch, Mad Dog Mattis, and all the other power players? To get closer to the truth, let us first look at her background and the path that led her to launch Theranos. Elizabeth Holmes was born in Washington, D.C. in 1984. She came from a relatively wealthy and well-connected family. Her father, Christian Rasmus Holmes IV, had a long distinguished career, mostly as a government bureaucrat, but also in private enterprise. Here's a list of his professional positions. Second Lieutenant, Civil Affairs, U.S. Army Reserve. Vice President for Tenneco Energy. Chief Financial Officer and third-ranking executive at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Director of U.S. Trade and Development Agency. Senior Vice President, Program Development at the Global Environment and Technology Foundation. Vice President for Strategic Conservation Initiatives at the World Wildlife Fund. Chief Operating Officer at the Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance. Member of the Market Advisory Board of Zegen Inc. Christian Rasmus Holmes IV was also vice president at Enron, which became the largest U.S. fraud case before his daughter snatched that distinction for Theranos. Here's how Richard Fuse, a family friend of the Holmeses, described Christian Rasmus. The father would speak quite often about their lineage. They really took that mantle of this family history very, very seriously indeed. That sense of her family's importance was also imparted to young Elizabeth. In a 2014 interview for The New Yorker, she said, "I grew up with those stories about greatness." Her own path to greatness would begin to take off when she was 18. Allegedly fluent in Mandarin, Elizabeth was included in a tour of China organized by Stanford University. During her freshman year at Stanford, she managed to convince chemistry professor Channing Robertson to let her work at his lab. Robertson granted her that wish, even though only advanced level and PhD students normally worked at his lab. Within that year, she was off on another tour of Asia, and this time she happened to have witnessed the SARS outbreak. Somehow, having only finished her freshman year at Stanford, she got a stint at the Genome Institute laboratory in Singapore, where she supposedly worked on developing systems to detect the SARS virus. Holmes returned from that trip determined to change the world and soon filed her first patent application, a wearable patch with microneedles that would continuously test the wearer's blood and administer the right dose of medicine in real time. At 19, she dropped out of Stanford and launched the venture that would become Theranos. Her star would rise for some 12 years, and by 2014 she also became the nation's favorite entrepreneur, treated as a veritable celebrity. But the dark secret at the core of Theranos was that its technology simply did not work. Of the 240 tests she claimed it could perform, it actually performed only 15, and none of them reliably or accurately. In spite of the facade of success and glamour, this secret was known to many Theranos employees and technicians. One of them was Erica Chong. She joined Theranos' team in 2013 and looked up to Elizabeth Holmes as a role model. But soon she discovered that Theranos Minilab produced very unreliable results and was scandalized that it was nevertheless used to diagnose patients, potentially putting their health and lives at risk. Chong brought these problems to her superiors' attention, but she was warned to keep quiet, intimidated, and placed under close and aggressive surveillance. At some point in 2014, Chong discussed these problems with her colleague Tyler Schultz, and together they resolved to raise these issues with Tyler's grandfather, George Schultz, who sat at Theranos' board of directors. As Tyler Schultz and Erica Chong testified, the two visited George Schultz at his home and warned him about the problems at Theranos. At the dinner table, they explained to him that when you think they've taken this blood sample and they put it in the device and it pops out a result, what really is happening is that the moment you step outside of the room, they take that blood sample, they run it to a back door, and there are 5 people on standby that are taking this tiny blood sample and splitting it amongst 5 different machines. This episode is extremely revealing, and it gives us an important indication that Theranos wasn't merely Elizabeth Holmes' project, but that it was actually sponsored by very powerful players in more important ways than we knew. Namely, if George Schultz had merely been duped by Holmes into supporting Theranos at risk of his own reputation, you would think that this revelation would have absolutely scandalized him. At the very least, he should have demanded an explanation from Holmes, and if there was any substance to his grandson's and Erica Chong's allegations, you'd expect that he would have immediately distanced himself from Theranos and sounded a warning to other board members and investors. But that's not what happened. George Schultz dismissed the whistleblowers, saying, "I know Tyler's very smart, you seem very smart, but the fact of the matter is I've brought in a wealth of intelligent people and they tell me that this device is going to revolutionize healthcare, and so maybe you two should consider doing something else." Chong resigned from Theranos the next day after only 7 months on the job. While Theranos continued in operation unhindered, she and Tyler Schultz became targets of very aggressive surveillance and intimidation. Keeping them silent was entrusted to David Boy's law firm, Boyce Schiller. Recall, David Boyce was also on Theranos' board of directors, and the fact that he had a hand in pressuring whistleblowers to keep quiet indicates that he too was in the know about Theranos' dark secrets. Again, instead of investigating those secrets, action was directed against disobedient employees. At a later point, George Schultz again invited his grandson to his house to convince him to keep quiet. On the occasion, Tyler expressed that he would consider signing a confidentiality agreement with Theranos, at which his grandfather said, "Good, there are 2 Theranos lawyers upstairs, can I go get them?" But ultimately his grandson declined to sign the papers. Eventually, the case was brought to the attention of the Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreiro, who had previously broken several stories of corporate malfeasance and had extensive experience with surveillance and intimidation. Carreiro said that this was a very stressful time. "I knew that they were working hard on intimidating sources and turning sources and making people recant. But apparently, Boyce Schiller's tactics went far beyond what he had ever experienced. I've been a reporter for over 20 years and I'd never experienced anything of that magnitude. I mean, it's not even close." Tyler Schultz apparently received the harshest treatment, so much so that even Boyce Schiller subsequently conceded that, in retrospect, he should have been treated more gently than he was. It was only in mid-October 2015 that the Wall Street Journal finally broke the big story, and from that point on, the genie was out of the bottle and the unraveling of Theranos was irreversible. Nonetheless, its powerful guardians continued defending the venture and Elizabeth Holmes until the very last, in spite of the fact that events were shaping up to become a scandal of absolutely massive proportions. Elizabeth Holmes was kept at helm well after she had lost support among many Theranos employees and managers. The directors and investors continued to back her because supposedly she was just such a strong leader and a brilliant CEO. General Mad Dog Mattis gushed over Holmes in a Fortune magazine article featuring her. Here is his statement. "She has probably one of the most mature and well-owned sense of ethics, personal ethics, managerial ethics, business ethics, medical ethics that I have ever heard articulated. The general is better known for his motto in life, be polite, be professional, but have a plan to kill everybody you meet. That motto may explain his nickname. Mattis stayed on as the director at Theranos all the way until late 2016 when Donald Trump nominated him as Secretary of Defense. Holmes' cult of personality was bolstered with the claim that she would be the next Steve Jobs. She herself had an obsession with emulating Jobs in many different ways. Apparently, this even led her to bring Avaris Avi Tevanian to Theranos' management team and board of directors. Tevanian had been the Steve Jobs' right-hand man at Apple, where he led the software team that developed the Mac operating system X. Unfortunately for Holmes, Tevanian also would turn out to be the only person in Theranos' managerial suite who ventured to ask probing questions demanding real answers and could not be intimidated into silence. He would soon demolish the myth of Holmes' supposed managerial brilliance. Don Lucas honestly believed that she was the next Steve Jobs, Tevanian said. I think that she didn't expect that I would ask tough questions. Having confronted Holmes with tough questions, Tevanian was so impressed with her that he demanded that she be immediately replaced as CEO. But since Holmes was protected, it was Tevanian who would resign. I was done with Theranos, he said. I had seen so many things that were bad go on. I would never expect that anyone would behave the way she behaved as a CEO. And believe me, I worked for Steve Jobs. I saw some crazy stuff, but Elizabeth took it to a new level. There were several more episodes from the Theranos saga that also couldn't be explained by Elizabeth Holmes' supposed brilliance. One was Theranos' cooperation with Pfizer on a pilot test for cancer patients. Knowing full well that her company's tests were unreliable, she nevertheless pressed ahead for this program, taking risks with unsuspecting patients' lives. Namely, blood tests are an important factor determining the dosage of medication for patients in chemotherapy, and false results could prove fatal. Apparently, this didn't bother either Holmes or Pfizer. In 2015, the Centers for Medicare and Medical Services conducted an inspection of Theranos' lab in Newark, California. In a letter they sent to Theranos, they confirmed that Theranos tests were unreliable and that inappropriate drug dosage caused immediate jeopardy to patients' health and safety. Then there was the inexplicable Walgreens deal. The collaboration between Theranos and Walgreens began as early as 2010, and by September 2013, Walgreens began to open Theranos wellness centers throughout its chain of pharmacies. Walgreens invested over $140 million in this partnership, but apparently never bothered to test whether Theranos technology even worked. They offered a menu of 192 tests, which were supposed to be done on Edison machines provided by Theranos, but only half of those tests could even theoretically be done on those devices. In reality, Walgreens illicitly ran 90% of the tests using traditional blood analysis equipment and remained committed to the deal for 6 years before they finally broke the partnership in June 2016. That, incidentally, was more than 7 months after Wall Street Journal had already run the John Carreiro story that unmasked Theranos as a fraud. Months and months of media hype may explain the fact that Elizabeth Holmes could dazzle the general public, but the idea that she could consistently deceive supposedly sophisticated investors and scores of industry specialists in firms like Walgreens, Safeway, GSK, and Pfizer, and that she could keep the fraud going for more than 12 years, that is very difficult to explain. I will propose that it is far more likely that Holmes was recruited to front for Theranos, but that the real power brokers behind the project remained behind the stage. Her real qualifications were her youth, unbridled ambition, absence of any scruples about deceiving her own employees, investors, and the public, and her ability to advance her goals over people's lives. She also had that sense of her family's greatness, which might have entitled her to set aside legal and ethical considerations in pursuing her mission. It probably also helped that she was allegedly fluent in Mandarin, perhaps because future health challenges were expected to come from China. We also know that an influential person twice introduced Holmes to Stanford professor of medicine Phyllis Gardner. Perhaps that same person also leaned on Professor Robertson to admit the unqualified Holmes into his chemistry lab. Furthermore, Holmes got her first million from Tim Draper because he was supposedly a friend of the family. Also, she was able to escape past the due diligence gatekeepers at Lucas Ventures Group straight into Don Lucas Sr.'s office thanks to an introduction from an unnamed friend of her father's. From everything we know, it seems that among Theranos directors it was George Shultz who had the most hands-on involvement with the company. His failure to investigate the concerns brought to him by his own grandson indicates that he was more concerned with protecting the venture than he was about his own reputation, the capital of Theranos investors, or the health and safety of the patients who relied on Theranos tests. George Shultz had ample time and resources to get to the bottom of these issues, but instead he took action to ensure that truth didn't come out. Another revealing moment was Holmes' interview with Harvard Law professor Jonathan Zittrain. He jokingly mentioned that the only person missing from her board of directors was the Pope, and then asked, "How did that happen? Was it, I'm just going to write to Henry Kissinger? These kinds of caliber of people are in the public eye, but probably not so easy to ring up." Holmes replied, "In our case, those were the people I had the privilege of getting to know and in many cases working with for, in some cases, a couple of years before we asked them to join the board." I don't know when or how Holmes met Shultz, Kissinger, Mattis, Bechtel, Roughead, Perry, Boyce, or none. But she tells us that she had been working with many of them for years before they joined Theranos as directors. Well, what were they working on? Most of these people were deeply rooted in the military and foreign policy establishment, and none of them had any expertise in medicine, biochemistry, blood testing, or healthcare. Yet mysteriously, they all decided to pool their considerable influence and raise a huge amount of capital in order to democratize diagnostics and revolutionize healthcare. And for some reason, they thought that the best way to do that was to entrust it to a 19-year-old with no qualifications or experience in any of the relevant domains. This all brings us to a really important question. Why? Why would anyone, and especially a group of very powerful individuals, contrive such an ambitious, elaborate, and unlikely venture? What moved George Shultz to get so closely involved with such an audacious, risky venture? By the time Theranos was set up, he was already in his 80s with a very distinguished career behind him, and Theranos was not a simple matter of flipping some tech investment with his retirement savings. It was a complex and long-term managerial undertaking in a domain in which he had no expertise. What was so important about democratizing diagnostics? However, before I attempt to answer that question, let us consider another important question. Suppose you were one of these very influential players like Shultz, Kissinger, Perry, Nunn, and so on. You decided to launch a venture to democratize diagnostics and revolutionize healthcare. In that case, why not go to companies like Siemens, Abbott Labs, or LabCorp that already had the right expertise, decades of experience, and world's most advanced diagnostic technology? Why not tap the industry's proven talent and use the hundreds of millions of dollars to incentivize them to build your solution? Wouldn't any reasonable person do exactly that? I do believe so, and most probably our Theranos Dream Team must have explored their option. But apparently that route did not work for them, and we can venture a guess why. Probably because the true biomedical experts like Dr. Phyllis Gardner or Dr. Darren Saunders, for example, would have told them that their project was impossible. Indeed, Dr. Gardner did not hesitate to say that Theranos investors were crazy to back such a venture. Now, if the objective of democratizing diagnostics through miniature, ultra-versatile blood analyzers was impossible, then why would any reasonable person continue to press on with that project? Why would a whole group of them stay committed to an unrealistic goal? What was so important about this venture? Was there an urgent lack of blood testing technology before 2003 holding back humanity's progress? Were people dropping dead for lack of miniature blood analyzers? For some reason, the Theranos project was important enough to our power players that they launched it with the 19-year-old Elizabeth Holmes in charge and took it to the market with a technology that didn't and couldn't function. In other words, they knowingly and deliberately sponsored a massive fraud, risking hundreds of millions of dollars as well as their reputations. What purpose could possibly justify such reckless, brazen action? Perhaps Bill Gates could help us answer that question. In a short 2-minute video published on YouTube on 27 January 2021, entitled "This is how we prevent the next pandemic," World's Chief Health Officer explains the rescue plan for when we have the next pandemic. By the next pandemic, says Comrade Gates, I believe we can have what I call mega-testing diagnostic platforms. They can be deployed quickly, cost very little, and test 20% of the entire population every week. To stop future pandemics quickly, we need to be able to spot disease outbreaks as soon as they happen anywhere in the world, and that requires a global alert system. Stopping the next pandemic will be a big investment. So fighting these next pandemics would require quick, cheap, and ultra-versatile platforms that can test 20% of the entire population every week. Doesn't that sound a lot like what Theranos was trying to build? Indeed, on the occasion of promoting the Walgreens partnership in 2013, Elizabeth Holmes explained, "We have an operational plan that will allow us to be within 5 miles from every person's home through Walgreens that we've opened and continue to open nationally." In other words, Theranos' plan was to build out the mega testing diagnostic infrastructure that would be needed to fight future pandemics. The explicit purpose of this infrastructure was to enable centralizing the healthcare process so that diagnostics, medication, and treatment could all come from the same source. Now, that kind of a thing could explain our power brokers' excitement about Theranos. It would be a very powerful tool of population control in the hands of those who were lusting to wield it. This agenda could explain the imperative of building network-connected mini-analyzers and distributing them widely so that they are available in the vicinity of every household. It may also explain why during the first 11 years Theranos' board of directors consisted almost exclusively of deep state actors, but no medical doctors or healthcare experts. That only changed in 2014 when Senator Bill Frist joined the board, perhaps to limit the fallout from the scandals that were beginning to emerge. This agenda also explains why the power players behind Theranos didn't care whether the technology actually worked or not. It was not intended as an accurate diagnostic tool. We already had those. It was intended as an information weapon. Unlike the PCR test, which has been known and well understood by healthcare professionals worldwide, Theranos technology would have remained hidden behind the veils of patents and protected intellectual property. The public would not be given the opportunity to have Theranos devices examined independently. Such checks would certainly be entrusted to reliable Theranos-friendly inspectors. The technology's legitimacy would instead be protected behind Elizabeth Holmes' personality cult. As her star rose, we were all encouraged to see her as a young genius, a successful entrepreneur, a brilliant inventor, and an all-round do-gooder. We were meant to see her just as General Mattis, the Mad Dog, described her, the anointed one with the most mature and well-honed sense of ethics that he had ever heard articulated. It is always difficult to be a skeptic in a hailstorm of propaganda in an environment where almost everyone agreed that Holmes was a genius, that she was wonderful and brilliant, and where the narrative that she had saved millions of lives was widely accepted and believed. It would be very risky to face down the adoring crowd and tell them that the emperor has no clothes. Perhaps only a few would dare to speak up, but such lone voices could always be dismissed, ridiculed, cancelled, or otherwise silenced. In this way, Theranos technology would be able to fulfill its purpose regardless of whether it actually worked or not. It was created as an information weapon with which to manage future pandemics, convince the population that they were facing a health threat, that emergency measures were needed, and that this or that kind of medication would be recommended or mandated. If this was the ultimate purpose of Theranos, then its importance for the kingmaker class went far beyond mere business considerations. Its unraveling would not deter them, and we should expect that they would regroup and try to come up with a new and improved technology to fulfill the same purpose. There's much evidence that this is indeed the case. At this time, the health authorities in many nations are preparing to abandon PCR testing and replace it with other kinds of tests. For example, in July this year, we found out that the Soros Economic Development Fund and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation would buy the UK-based COVID testing company Mologic, which allegedly developed a 10-minute test for COVID. According to Forbes, the buyout was done to increase access to affordable, state-of-the-art medical technology via a rapid lateral flow test, which offers early warning screening. Among the traditional providers of blood testing technologies, we've also seen focused commitment to offer faster, more reliable, and more widely available testing. And the venture capitalists' quest to democratize diagnostics with miniature network-connected analyzers hasn't withered either. Abundant funding has flowed to companies like Truvion, Athelas, and Genelite, which are presently working to fulfill a part of the ambitious Theranos mission. Genelite's founder, Kerry Gunn, has been explicit about embracing Elizabeth Holmes' vision as valid and important, and expressed his team's intention to execute on that vision and succeed where Theranos had failed. So the information arms race is still very much on, and the power players who brought us Theranos haven't given up on their agenda. This is a war on and for our minds. If we heed the warnings from Bill Gates, we must expect to see more pandemics. Mega-testing diagnostic platforms might spring up in our neighborhoods, and we might be pressured to take those tests regularly and believe the results they produce. The health authorities will save us from danger, and they'll tell us exactly what's expected of us to protect ourselves and others. This could be our children's future, and it is indeed a very dark vision, but as I promised at the start of this report, there is a very beautiful, encouraging and inspiring side to the story of Theranos and everything that it implies. Namely, we had a group of very powerful people who decided to pool their influence and resources and create a technology that would allow them to manage and control the global response to pandemics. What they envisioned turned out to be a fantasy, but this did not hold them back, and this implies that their agenda was based on a grand deception from the get-go. Still, they did not hesitate to press on. With all the power and resources at their disposal, they thought they would pull it off one way or another. They recruited their front woman, and in 2003 the venture launched. For a good many years it made great progress, and by 2012-2013, with Theranos, Walgreens and Safeway deals shaping up, it started to break into the mainstream. Diagnostics really were getting democratized. Elizabeth Holmes started making guest appearances of many prominent TV news shows, and her face was on the cover of many high-circulation magazines. President Barack Obama appointed her as U.S. Ambassador for Global Entrepreneurship, and Harvard Medical School added her to the Board of Fellows. The awards and accolades from prestigious institutions across the United States multiplied, and the success stories seemed like proof positive that there was no limit to what the kingmaker class could accomplish when they set their minds to it. Things didn't have to be true, it was only necessary that ordinary people believed them. But even with Homestar in its zenith, a handful of her employees could not keep quiet, and no amount of wealth or power in the world could expunge the rot at the core of Theranos. After that fateful dinner between Tyler Shultz, Erica Chong, and Tyler's grandfather, George Shultz, the powerful men behind Theranos resolved to defend their creation. They aggressively stepped up the campaign of intimidation of Theranos employees in order to silence any potential whistleblowers. They did so through pervasive surveillance, confidentiality agreements, and threats with potentially devastating career-ending lawsuits. Incidentally, that is another reason why Theranos preferred to rely on young and inexperienced employees. They are far more vulnerable to intimidation than real experts with established reputations in the industry. The job of insulating Theranos from any truth leaking out was entrusted to David Boy's law firm, which came down on whistleblowers with extreme prejudice. The pressure was such that one of Theranos' longtime employees could not endure it. In 2013, Ian Gibbons, who had worked at Theranos since 2005 and led their chemistry team, was subpoenaed to testify in a court case brought against Theranos by Richard Fuse. 2 days before his scheduled appearance in court, Gibbons was notified by Theranos that he'd been involved in the case. But rather than give his testimony, Ian Gibbons decided to take his own life. Theranos was brought down essentially by 5 people: Erica Chong, Tyler Shultz, Ian Gibbons' widow, Richard Fuse, and the Wall Street Journal's reporter John Carreiro. The events that led to this unraveling slowly escalated from the patent dispute between Richard Fuse and Theranos. Recall, Dr. Fuse was the friend of the Holmeses. He was also a medical doctor and an inventor who built up and sold his own company. It was Dr. Fuse, in fact, who flagged the case to John Carreiro and shared his findings with him. By 2014, the powerful guardians of Theranos already had all of these individuals under tight surveillance. Nevertheless, with the exception of Ian Gibbons, they stood their ground and refused to be silenced. As John Carreiro explained, they couldn't in good conscience continue to not say anything. They felt the need to speak up, and they felt that lives were in danger and that the longer this went on, the worse it would get. Thus, on the one side of this saga, you had the resolute powers of deep state actors, powerful lawyers, and ultra-wealthy investors determined to preserve and protect their creation by any means necessary. On the other side, you had a handful of ordinary people armed with truth and compelled by their conscience to speak the truth in spite of fear, intimidation, and seemingly insurmountable odds stacked against them. Even John Carreiro's boss, the powerful media magnate Rupert Murdoch, was one of the largest investors in Theranos, and there was a good chance that his story would be killed. But for some mysterious reason, Murdoch, who had invested $125 million into Theranos, refused to kill Carreiro's story, even though Elizabeth Holmes had twice personally implored him to do that. Murdoch, who was not about interfering in his publication's editorial decisions, refused to interfere, saying that he had confidence in his journalists and editors to make the right decisions. And they did. On 15 October 2015, the Wall Street Journal ran the article titled "Hot Startup Theranos Has Struggled with Its Blood Test Technology." This article triggered an irreversible unraveling of the fraudulent venture that all the money, power, and influence in the world could neither arrest nor reverse. The spectacular rise and equally spectacular fall of Theranos thus holds 6 important lessons that are particularly relevant in today's world. 1. Do not be intimidated by great power. Insofar as large, ambitious agendas are based on lies and deception, they are very fragile and have a limited shelf life, even if they are pursued by the world's most powerful people with seemingly inexhaustible resources. To succeed, they must mobilize the creative energies of many people, and if there is no consensus that the agenda is desirable and useful to society, this is difficult and can be entirely solved with monetary incentives. As we've seen in Theranos' case, to implement a nefarious plan, the power players must rely on pliable people who can be easily coerced and intimidated. But such people lack authority, can't command respect, and their ability to lead will fall short. If you can't mobilize the best respected people to lead, your agenda's success will depend on the leadership qualities of mediocrities motivated by fear and money. That's not a winning proposition. 2. A handful of courageous, principled individuals committed to justice and truth can defeat even the most powerful networks, even if for a time they may seem invincible. 3. Do not be too impressed with the tech. When they try to impress us with super advanced, game-changing technologies, artificial intelligence, and all that, they are usually trying to intimidate us into submission and voluntary compliance. I've spent many years working extensively in AI development, and I can tell you this: such systems are very difficult to put together. They are always limited in what they can do, they're fragile, they're high maintenance, and in most cases they work about as well as Theranos miniature analyzers. 4. They are stupid. I've spent a good deal of time watching, reading, and listening to speeches, interviews, and various statements of many individuals in the highest echelons of power today. And the more I listened, the more I had a very strong impression that these people aren't very bright. It seems to me that they often have trouble distinguishing between their delusions of omnipotence and what's achievable and realistic in the real world. Theranos was exactly an example of this, but I've taken note of several other examples of mega projects that never stood a chance. 5. Resistance is never futile. Power plays take time to unravel, and for a while they may seem invincible. Being courageous and principled may seem stupid, but if you're in that situation, you are probably not alone, and in ways you can't predict, some confluence of events will redeem you. There are many unknown, unseen brave souls whose powers are multiplying the longer they stand their ground. Never surrender. 6. Truth is important. Often it takes effort to uncover the truth and courage to speak it. But truth is the light that will guide us to freedom. As Mohandas Gandhi said, there is no God higher than truth. Accordingly, my advice would be to shake off the pessimism and embrace all those qualities that will turn you into the best version of yourself. Integrity, courage, and respect for truth. Reject fear and disbelieve the hollow myths about the so-called elites. That they are smart, that they are sophisticated, well organized, that their power is irresistible, and that they are unstoppable. On the contrary, their track record of flops and failures is very long and equally impressive. Their power is hollow. It is a fiction that's meant to hypnotize us into submission and obedience. If we only reject that fiction, their power will deflate like a pierced balloon. With that, I'll conclude this report. Thank you for joining me again today at the Markets, Trends and Profits channel. If you appreciated this content, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. And if you trade, be sure to look into systematic trend following and our daily Trend Compass reports. Trend following will help you navigate the markets profitably with confidence and peace of mind, and can turn your investing into a lifelong success. Until my next report, keep well, stay free, and I'll see you soon.